Hi, my name is Caleb Benedict, and I'm here today to talk about gentrification and the ethics involved with this concept. What is gentrification? Gentrification, according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is a process of renewal and rebuilding accompanying the influx of middle class or affluent people into deteriorating areas that often displaces poorer residents. Many of us think of gentrification as a negative thing, and rightfully so. There are very many negative connotations that are associated with this concept. Here's another definition, and this definition came from Peter Marcuse, who in 1985 wrote an article in the Journal of Urban and Contemporary Law. His definition is gentrification occurs when new residents, who disproportionately are young, white, professional, technical, and managerial workers with higher educations and income levels, replace older residents who disproportionately are lower income, working class, and poor, minority and ethnic group members, and the elderly, from older and previously deteriorated inner city housing in a spatially concentrated manner. That is, to a degree differing substantially from the general level of change in the community or region as a whole. So these two definitions paint a picture of gentrification being something where populations shift and there's a socioeconomic component to that. And all things considered, in today's day and age, with the process of urbanization, there are many lower income individuals that unfortunately are being displaced from urban environments. Now, the history of gentrification, in a summarized manner, for specifically the United States' history, can be broken down into 4 parts. These 4 parts built upon one another and resulted in gentrification as we know it today. Beginning with white flight or abandonment, and this was essentially after World War II, there was a great movement from middle class individuals and families who were living in the urban areas who relocated quite quickly to the suburban areas. And then there's redlining. Redlining was the unethical practice from bankers and other financial institutions that prevented home mortgage lending to specifically minority groups and neighborhoods designated by lenders. And they literally used a red line with maps of city neighborhoods to distinguish where they could or should and shouldn't finance individuals. And unfortunately, there's a race aspect to that, and unfortunately, minorities were targeted. Urbanization. A few decades after abandonment and redlining as well, urbanization occurred. And urbanization is just probably what most of us think it is. It's the process where large numbers of people relocate to the inner cities for reasons such as being proximate to employment opportunities and then other attractions that this city has. Displacement. Displacement is people being forced to relocate out of a neighborhood, often due to significant changes that happen in a short period of time. And these changes are changes such as steep increases in rent, home prices going up drastically, and then property taxes in addition to that. Not to forget cost of living as a whole. So abandonment and white flight. According to Peter Marcuse, who wrote that article in the Urban Law Journal, abandonment and gentrification both are reflections of a single long-term process resulting from the changing economy of a central city. White flight, the departure of whites from places such as urban neighborhoods or schools, increasingly or predominantly populated by minorities. And then here's another excerpt from an article written by Jennifer Blakesley in the Institute for Research on Poverty newsletter in 1979. Over the past 2 decades, the plight of America's cities has become almost commonplace of social comment. While city tax bases are eroding and their job markets declining as companies seek cheaper, newer, or more accessible facilities in the suburbs, their schools and services struggle against the combined impact of inflation, unemployment, and shrinking federal assistance. These cities are seen increasingly as deteriorating ghettos for the poor, the unemployed, and the disadvantaged, and above all, for minorities. This essentially went to show that after abandonment and white flight occurred, The cities were significantly impacted in a negative way, and the people who remained were also impacted. And unfortunately, redlining became a common practice by lending institutions. And according to the Business Dictionary, redlining is usually unlawful discriminatory banking practice whereby those living in or doing business in certain poor neighborhoods are either denied credit or have to pay a higher than normal rate. It is discriminatory lending. That is what it is, and it's very unfortunate and unethical. And then urbanization. Urbanization is almost the last step that we think of when we think of gentrification, but it's essentially a shift of a specific group, oftentimes middle and upper class individuals, into the urban environments. Merriam-Webster defines urbanization as the process by which towns and cities are formed and become larger as more and more people begin living and working in central areas. I myself would be considered someone who is urbanized. I moved from Idaho to Portland, Oregon. I live in the city. I own a home in the city, and this is just a small representation of quite a few people I know, and it's this movement that's a recent movement into the urban areas from the suburban areas. And then displacement. This is the unfortunate side effect of gentrification. Displacement is, according to Peter Marcuse, a result of each of these developments. The poor are displaced. They are displaced when businesses desire to move in because the land is too valuable to house them further. They are displaced when gentrification takes place because the buildings in the neighborhoods are too expensive for them. They are displaced when abandonment takes place because the buildings in the neighborhoods are unsuitable to provide decent housing for them. It's quite interesting. An unfortunate part of displacement can be found in this excerpt. People who are being displaced who may not want to be displaced. And then here's another example by Emily Ponder, who wrote an article in the Southwest Journal for International Law. And here's that excerpt. Many landlords in gentrified neighborhoods have a strong financial motivation to deregulate stabilized apartments to increase rent, or may seek to remove undesirable tenants so that wealthy white families will feel comfortable moving in. Thus, they resort to harassment, baseless evictions that are directed primarily at tenants of color. These acts clearly conflict with the guarantee of legal security of tenure and violate the right to adequate housing. This is incredibly unethical, but unfortunately, we see this throughout the research on gentrification and changing cities. You have landlords and property managers working together, trying to evict or displace individuals so that they can bring in higher paying tenants, even if it causes them to break a lease agreement or to somehow motivate them to displace themselves. Some other examples of the impacts of gentrification: rent increases, property value increases, income decreases oftentimes for reasons such as a city might change to be more of a technology sector focused city instead of an industrial focused city. There are fewer maybe jobs because of that transition in the industrial opportunities market, and that person may not have the skills to work in the technology sector. That is just one example. But all this to show, most if not all examples of gentrification go to show that there is a significant increase in the overall cost of living. Here, Enterprise Community, using census data, built a graphic showing how since 2001 there's a trend upwards in overall renting housing costs, and unfortunately a steady decrease in renter income. Same source, U.S. Census, that shows that there's a steady incline since the 1960s on overall cost burdens that renters must face to rent. Now, the ethics that go into this. Let me highlight the unethical components of gentrification. Redlining. Redlining was completely unethical. It targeted minorities specifically and did not allow them to become financed for home purchases. Tenant neglect. Very unfortunate. It happens all too often when landlords, property managers do actions upon their tenants to try to get them to move out, because they know that if they do, they can make more money from someone who is urbanizing. It's very unfortunate. Emily Ponder wrote in the Journal of International Law. It is a pattern seen over and over again in my work as a tenants attorney in New York City. When landlords and developers are positioned to earn far more from gentrifiers than from long-standing lower-income tenants, they often resort to extreme measures to force those tenants out. Landlords neglect to make repairs, they cut off access to heat and electricity, and they allow perpetual rat and bed bug infestations. It's quite unfortunate. Here are some mitigation techniques that municipalities and other local governments can take into consideration when trying to cushion the negative impacts gentrification can have upon a community. But let me first say, in response to redlining, the federal government in the 1990s passed the Fair Housing Act. And the Fair Housing Act was essentially, according to the Housing and Urban Development website, the Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination when they are renting, buying, or securing financing for any housing. The prohibition specifically covered discrimination because of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, and the presence of children. Conditional development zones are zones that local governments specifically identify and control what type of development goes in that zone and where specifically in that zone they can build. Expansion zones are somewhat similar, but it's the motivating part. They motivate developers by doing things like waiving permit fees and offering tax subsidies to promote affordable housing. And then that leads into affordable housing. That's the biggest mitigation technique local governments can have to cushion negative impacts of gentrification. Anything they can do to promote affordable housing, such as raising money for this type of development through housing trust funds, offering exclusionary zoning opportunities where within that zone only affordable housing must be built, and then offering tax incentives or tax relief to individuals who might be considered low income and can't pay the steep increases in tax basis for their properties that they maybe own. So to conclude, this is a very ethical dilemma, the idea of gentrification. Supply and demand cause people to urbanize or abandon communities. That's something that has happened. The unethical components of that are things like lending discrimination, which can be found in redlining, and then tenant neglect, which can be found in property managers, property owners, landlords doing certain actions that try to entice or motivate individuals to leave their properties before their lease is up so that they can turn around and make more of a profit. Here are my sources, and thank you very much.